So let's go over um, William Glasser, and he has um, basically two terms, and a lot of people use them interchangeably. One is choice theory, the other is reality therapy. Technically, he wrote a book on reality therapy long before he wrote the book on choice theory. Reality therapy just became well known. So that's kind of his more original concept. Later, it was changed to choice theory. That's one of his more recent books before he passed away. So there are some controversial things about William Glasser. So, for instance, um, and people have to address them because he's not only a therapist, he's a psychiatrist. So when he criticizes diagnosis or diagnoses by psychiatrists, including a lot of the medication, in fact, he wrote a book about it, he can't just they can't just respond by saying, well, what's he know? He's just a therapist, but he's a psychiatrist, so they kind of have to take him seriously. I kind of take that with a grain of salt. It seems that most theorists, most of the classical theorists, are somewhat extreme in their beliefs. So, for example, Glasser would say that he really doesn't believe in diagnoses. He believes that most issues are the result of psychological or emotional issues. However, uh, at the other extreme, most psychiatrists fully buy into diagnoses and possibly medication. I'm somewhere in between. I believe that there are many diagnoses that are overdiagnosed. I believe that, yes, diagnoses are valid, but a lot of times they're overused. I believe that diagnoses can help us to better treat an individual, to better meet their counseling needs. I believe that a lot of diagnoses in the United States result in medication, and for some, medication is needed. But for others, I believe that just like we are overdiagnosed, we're often over-medicated. So we have to find that balance, I think. I also think that diagnosis and medication are never the sole answer, that they should always go hand in hand with talk therapy. So somebody shouldn't just be given medication, it should always be combined with therapy. But psychiatrists are at one end, and Glasser was at the total other end of the extreme. And I think it's good to find that middle ground. So that's the big controversy about Glasser, but the rest of his theory is, I would say pretty normal, pretty applicable. So, born in 1925, died in 2013. Hard to believe it's 10 years ago now. Educated at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio. He had a varied background as well, but you can kind of see these early pursuits and how they kind of fit his personality, but he really didn't find them meaningful. But kind of like you can see how his personality is played out in these early pursuits as well as his psychological theories. So started out as a chemical engineer, but pretty soon he turned to psychology and then psychiatry, trained at the Veterans Administration in UCLA in Los Angeles. He rejected Freud's theory very early on. Had originally come up with the theory of reality therapy by 1962. That is kind of the book that really got him well known, reality therapy. But he changed it considerably after that book was published. So his basic premise is that we are responsible for what we choose to do. He believed that people don't take responsibility for their own choices in life. And remember, even choosing not to make a choice is a choice. So that's kind of a little existential, foundation. Although I don't think he would call himself existential. We're all products of our past, but we're not victims in the present. So he believed that environment can impact us, like our upbringing or our life experiences, but we don't have to be victims of our experience. We can make our own choices in the present. So all of the problems are dealt with in the present, and relationship is stress. So that second part of your essay is all going to be in the present. What's going on with Sam now? So he says his theory is not very effective with extremely young children, but it's good for their parents. And by extremely young, I would probably say like before school age, the child does have to comprehend that they can make choices and that their choices have consequences, and that they can think about what those consequences are or might be. They might be right, they might be wrong, but they can kind of anticipate the result of those choices. And if they're incorrect, or if it doesn't result in a positive consequence, they can change that choice. But I know that I teach my own kids about personal responsibility, around kindergarten, first grade. They can understand that. I think that he promoted education. He worked in schools excessively. He wrote a book on counseling in schools. Believed that success in school could help individuals overcome other issues. He consulted for several years with the Ventura School for Girls, the California Youth Authority. So I think this was probably an interesting experience for him, because most of these girls were probably teenagers, under the age of 18, probably over the age of 12, so between 12 and 18, probably. And I think this theory works really well with adolescents. In fact, it's one of the most successful populations that I've used this theory with. I think a lot of times, if parents or guardians use this theory, they kind of use it in a way that is part of discipline, but in reality, it's not meant to be used that way at all. It's to empower people. so that they know that they are in control of the choices that they make. So if you're in control of your choices, you're also responsible for the result of those choices. So I think if you use this theory in an empowering way, people find that to be a very positive thing, especially teenagers. So I use this a lot with teenagers when I was working with them, and it was very easy for them to understand by that age. I tone it down a lot for like elementary and middle school kids. So here's an interesting thing, like Glasser got a lot of the ideas for choice theory from a guy named William Powers, who wrote control theory. And, I guess Glasser thought it was okay. Well, I'm just going to change a few things and rename it choice theory. I think that's a better name. So, I've never read William Powers' control theory, but I almost don't want to. Like, how much did he take from this poor guy? He gives him credit and yet kind of runs with it. So I give Glasser much more credit for reality therapy than for choice theory. They're both very similar. But it's someday I'll have to read William Powers. 1998, he published the book Choice Theory, A New Psychology of Personal Freedom. The books he's most famous for are Reality Therapy, like I mentioned, that was an early one. And the one he wrote about schools was called Schools Without Failure. If I was going to read any of them, if I were you, like if you were picking some books to read, probably Choice Theory would encompass all of them, like the best of all his previous books. So I probably would read Choice Theory if I was only going to read one of them. So when we talk about reality therapy, it's kind of based on a combination of reality therapy and Powers control theory, both modified over time. So I mentioned this earlier, but Glasser believed that the underlying root of most issues has to do with our human relationships. And either the client does not have a significant relationship in their life, or the client is involved in an unsatisfying relationship. I think that some of the most interesting examples in video of Glasser using his theory are when he's working with individuals or couples on a relationship. And I think my favorite part of it, of any of the sessions, is how in a relationship, people come into therapy and they're always talking about what the other person does in the relationship or what they don't do and how unsatisfied they are in the relationship. Well, Glasser's response is, well, what do you do in the relationship? What responsibility do you take in this relationship? What choices are you making? How are you contributing or not contributing to the relationship in a positive way? It tries to keep things positive. So it teaches the client to behave in more effective ways, which will ultimately facilitate better relationships. The therapeutic goal being to gain some satisfying relationship. So I'm not sure whether he's talking about a romantic, like significant other relationship, or just a satisfying, healthy relationship. Because ultimately, I would say any healthy relationship, because if I can have a healthy friendship with somebody, I can have a healthy romantic relationship with somebody. It's all about learning how to have healthy relationships. And that would include any relationship. So, like I said, he doesn't believe in the DSM or diagnoses or labels. One of his most recent books was Warning, Psychiatry Can Be Hazardous to Your Mental Health. So that was probably his controversial book. All right. So one of the things he does is he wants individuals to change their language so that they take responsibility for their choices, which result in what they are experiencing and feeling. He goes to somewhat extremes. So, for instance, I believe that people experience depression for various reasons. One reason might be a chemical imbalance. There's not a lot people can do to control that on their own. They can, go to therapy, they can take medication. There's a lot of things we can do to work with them, but I wouldn't say it was a result of choices they made. But other people may experience depression because, they were in unhealthy relationships, or they made some choices and they weren't successful in them, or they're in an unmeaningful situation or something like that. But I don't think people are always experiencing mental health issues because of their choices. That's a difference, but some are. And we can change some of our mental health experiences by changing our choices. Others, it might take more than that. If somebody's suffering from schizophrenia, it's probably not the result of personal choices. However, I can help them cope with that diagnosis by making healthy choices, by differentiating their personal choices from their diagnosis and the symptomology of that diagnosis. So it may not be the cause, but I think making healthy choices can help any situation and any individual. Making unhealthy choices can usually add some detrimental results. So he has people change their language, and as a result, it changes the way they perceive the situation. So he might say, I'm choosing to depress instead of I am depressed. So giving them control over the depression rather than it being passive. So it changes the language from being passive, it's happening to me, to being active. They're in control of the choices. So I think one of the most important things in this theory, which is really taken from Maslow, is people are born with 5 needs, and that we make choices so that those 5 needs can be met. So the 5 needs: survival, love and belonging, power, freedom, fun. I usually, if we're talking about careers, I usually place that somewhere in the power realm, if you're going to talk about a career. So he would maintain that one or more of these needs are most likely not being met with a client that comes to therapy. Once we process what needs are not being met, we also need to process what choices are we making that result in this need not being met. So obviously the choices aren't working for us. Why continue to make the same choices? No, we have to make new choices, healthier choices. So an example of that can be seen pretty easily in a lot of relationships. I'll just use myself as an example. Sometimes people choose to get to know and to date a certain type of individual. So I don't know why, people are drawn to a certain type. It may have to do with what we were brought up with or experiences we've had or whatever. But I usually either dated, got engaged to, or married musicians, often from other countries. But it was never a healthy relationship, the people I was drawn to. So eventually I decided that I would examine my choices and what led to those choices, because it wasn't working for me. And my goal, I had reached a certain age in life. I wanted a healthy family. That was one of my goals. And so I decided to just, learn to understand myself, to accept myself for who I was, or to make positive changes in my life. So I just lived alone for a couple years, dealt with my own issues. First, I hated living by myself. Why? Because I didn't like myself. So, but eventually I learned to make the changes I needed, to be a healthier individual, which would then lead to a healthier relationship with other people, not just significant others, but friends and family and clients. So being healthy myself led to healthy relationships, learning to accept myself and believe that I deserved love and acceptance unconditionally led to healthier relationships and the unconditional positive regard and acceptance of others in my life. And so, now I'm happily married, 4 kids. So Glasser was right about that. And, change in priorities and decisions. And, this happens with my friends in other countries. I'm like, I don't believe in or condone like things like arranged marriages or anything like that, or patriarchal societies, huge negatives. But I do talk with some of my friends, and they don't date when they're younger. They're not allowed to date the opposite gender. And when it's time to get married, if they want to get married, they can. And the whole family is included in this process. And so my one friend, I asked him, well, how did you meet your wife? And because I knew that the family, was involved in it and was somewhat of arranged marriage, and he seemed so happy. And he said, well, my grandfather, who was the patriarch of the family, took him to the community temple, and they sat together all day, and they asked him, is there anybody that you liked? And everybody was walking through the temple, and he pointed out a neighbor that he knew as a friend, and that's who he said he liked. And so they arranged that. But he said that, dating and the first year of marriage was totally different than it was in America. So, for instance, if they went on a date, the entire family would go along. And after they got married, it wasn't, he explained it wasn't like infatuation, they believe that mutual respect and getting to know one another as humans and friends and family took a long time. And if you were kind and respectful, that would occur naturally. And so the bond is very different. It is kind of a long-term friendship that evolves into a loving relationship through mutual respect. And, and I'm not saying it happens all the time. I'm not saying there's not like abusive relationships or anything, but it's very different than the way we enter into relationships. So how many times do people enter into a relationship and it doesn't work out, and then they enter into another relationship and the same thing happens over and over and over again, even though it's different people that they're dating, the end result is the same. The personality type is the same type of person that they're drawn to doesn't result in a healthy relationship. And so Glasser's just saying that, we have to examine, why this pattern keeps repeating itself. Why do we keep entering into unhealthy relationships or making those same choices just with different people? So we have to make some different choices that may include some choices about ourselves so that it can result in a healthy relationship. So I think, there's a lot to these basic needs when we start examining why they're not being met, what choices we're making that might not be healthy, what are some better choices that we can make. So let's see. So we examine those 5 things in therapy. We usually ask ourselves, what is a successful life? And he would say, well, we need at least one successful relationship. Let's see. He believes in teaching his theory to his clients so that they can understand the process and what they'll be doing in therapy. So one concept that he talks about, I think this is one of the more difficult concepts to understand. It's called the quality world. And he doesn't get into this aspect a lot, but I believe that people's quality worlds are based on their needs. And if needs are being met and it results in happiness or some payoff, then that becomes part of their quality world. What Glasser doesn't really talk about is that sometimes quality worlds are unhealthy. So if somebody has a drug addiction and the payoff is a high, that's not a healthy quality world, but it's definitely something that's going to direct their behavior and their choices. So one of the things that I talk about with clients is what goes into their quality world. And so when I was younger, kind of adventure and excitement went into my quality world. And now it's more like peace and security go into my quality world. And, so I think the quality world can change and become more healthy once we identify what needs are being met and what aren't being met. So let's say we identify a healthy quality world, and Glasser believes that one of the goals of therapy is for the therapist and therapy to end up in that quality world, for the client to realize that therapy is beneficial to them, that it has positive payoffs, that it helps them to meet those needs that aren't being met. And that the professional relationship with a therapist is a healthy model of a relationship. So he does give this image of a car. I don't think you need to worry about that. It's just basically what leads the car in a specific direction, but it's just a metaphor. You don't have to include that in your exam. He believes that we all make suffering choices. We choose to suffer. Once again, sometimes bad things happen to good people. I'm not always the cause of my suffering, but I'm guessing that he's talking about if suffering is the result of our choices, then many times we choose to suffer. So we kind of have to place that in context. He believes that anger is kind of a cop-out. It's an easy choice. It's kind of socially acceptable. We don't become too aggressive, but it's really depressing and other symptoms is kind of restrained anger. Depression is a means to ask for help indirectly without begging or reducing our power. Well, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm feeling really down. Oh, what's wrong? So I'm not actually asking for help, but the natural reaction is to say, what's wrong? How can I help? So it's an indirect plea for help. He also believes that depression and other symptomology allow us to avoid doing what we fear. So sometimes fear does prohibit our actions. Okay. So he does believe that we keep things in the present, that we can't change the past, but we can choose how to move forward. So usually, I spent a lot of years counseling clients who had experienced many different types of abuse. And once we processed the abuse, once we kind of got them to a place in their lives where we dealt with the trauma, at some point in therapy, without fail, the client has to make a choice. Do they choose to remain a victim and live in that negative space? Or do they choose to move on with their lives? This isn't negating the trauma. Trauma's been processed. We've dealt with it. It happened in the past, but they have to make a choice about how they want to live the rest of their lives. I would say that they don't want to live their future or their present in their past. And that has to be a cognitive and emotional choice that clients eventually need to make. So he might ask some questions in therapy. What are your relationships like, if any? What are some of your needs or goals? Are they positive? Are they being met through your current choices and behaviors? It says techniques are building positive relationships between therapist and client, gentle confrontation. But in reality, I want you to use WDEP as your techniques. It's very simple and it's straightforward. So W stands for wants and needs. I think there's a difference between wants and needs, but this part of it, W, can include both. Figuring out whether they're positive and healthy or unhealthy, and then once you decide what the healthy wants and needs are that aren't being met, then you decide what choices have been made in the past that aren't meeting them, and perhaps what are some new choices, which leads to D, directing and doing. So, you know, we're going to direct different choices to these goals, and we're going to try them out. E is evaluating, how did those choices work? Did they work out for me? Did they not? And then P, planning and commitment for the future. So it's pretty straightforward, but if you look in the notes and keep scrolling through, like, you know, the Glasser Institute and things like that, there's 2 pages of in-depth Wobelding handouts on WDEP. And depending on how far you want to get into this, you can keep it very basic, and I'm sure you can get a paragraph or 2 out of that. Just the basic concepts of WDEP, choices, things like that. Or if you want, you can go into more detail if you choose to. So there's both a diagram on the first page and there's a description on the second page, an outline of WDEP, the procedures, things like that. But just using the basics that I described would be enough. But for your own information, this goes into a lot more detail. So now that we've gone over the theory, do you have any other questions about how you might apply this to the case of Sam on the exam? You have a good idea of how it works? Going once, going twice. All right, the exam is due before the next class. We do have